law is how they wrote the law on replica firearms. And how the replica firearms that actually can't hurt anybody are illegal. There we go.
Just so everyone understands, we are recording this so that we can provide this later on. Sorry, my apologies.
No problem.
We're still sharing.
Okay, so the difference between a Hollywood movie and real life, as I was saying, there's nothing exciting or pretty about a real life gunfight. And to paraphrase 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, a gunfight is nasty, brutish, and short. The longer it lasts, the more people get hurt. Because I work with a lot of professionals, the idea is that a firearm is a tool. And sometimes in many occupations, it's a required tool. So one of the things I want to talk about today is just some basic terminology so people can get an idea of what we're talking about. If a firearms case comes up in court, you'll be familiar with the terminology, how we classify firearms in Canada, a little bit on the safety of firearms. In other words, what people should be doing if they're acting responsibly with firearms. And then we'll get into how firearms are acquired in Canada. We'll talk a little bit about how people get licenses, the safety training requirements, things like that. And very unlikely that any of your particular clients are ever going to have proper licenses or all the safety training and everything else. So we'll talk about what they should have or what the legal owners do in Canada. And we'll talk about some of the firearms regulations and offenses, and we'll introduce you to some of the interesting quirks in the firearms laws. And then I want to talk about the science behind firearms, firearms training. I talked a little bit about how police are trained to use firearms, but how police are trained to use firearms would simply apply to anyone who's using a firearm in any kind of a high stress situation. It's not exclusive to police. We'll talk about the evolution of firearms training in Canada, and we'll talk a little bit about how police are trained to use deadly force and why they're trained to use deadly force. And then we'll talk about some of the myths about firearms and compare that to the reality of firearms. And I think at the very end of the presentation, I have a couple of take-home points that everybody will get a real good kick out of. You know, for example, you don't solve every murder case in exactly 38 minutes to leave time for commercials. That's what they call the CSI effect. Every citizen thinks that their case should be solved in exactly 38 minutes and that the crime scene experts are going to show up in a Hummer.
In fairness to Britain, it's about 55 minutes, but you know.
Okay, so first of all, what is a firearm? Well, I brought some sample firearms here. These firearms are not real. These are pellet gun versions of the firearm. So there's nothing here that could possibly harm anyone. I'm not going to point at anybody at all. In fact, I won't even point at it.
I was going to say, do you want to turn off the PowerPoint while you're and do that?
I think I'm going to leave the PowerPoint on for a little bit. Yeah, because everyone will get a chance to see this up close a little bit more. But what I'm going to do is for everyone here in the room is I'm going to do my basic safety check. So I'll point the firearm in a safe direction. I open the moving parts, which is called the action. I confirm that there's nothing whatsoever in here. And I always do a barrel check just to make sure that there's nothing down there whatsoever. So a firearm is a barreled weapon. The legal definition is that it fires a projectile that could cause serious injury or death. So the Canadian government has done a lot of forensic tests. And one of the things they've determined is that the velocity and the energy of the projectile is quite critical. If that projectile could hurt but not kill, then it would not be considered a firearm. So, for example, a pellet gun could potentially be a firearm. if it was a very high velocity. So I'm not going to get into the exact details, but if it fires a pellet at approximately 500 feet per second, then it would be considered a firearm. So for example, if we went to the local gun store and we wanted to look at a pellet rifle, some of them might be over with the firearms section because they're considered legally firearms. Some of them would be with the pellet gun section, or basically the non-regulated sort of the toy section.
Sherry speaking.
So that is the definition.
Hello.
Of firearm.
Trace, you're on speaker.
I don't know if she's coming down or something or anything, but we asked her if she wanted to speak to a lawyer because she called.
Yeah.
And she's really staring at us. Not answering.
There we go.
Apologies.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, let's move on. A firearm is a barrel weapon. So the barrel of the firearm is the part of the firearm that contains the projectile as it's being fired up that barrel. The end of the barrel is called the muzzle. So the hole at the end of the barrel is where the projectile emerges. So one of the important points on firearm safety is we tell people keep the muzzle pointed in a safe direction. So that's what we mean is the end of the barrel of the firearm. At the other end of the barrel is where we find something called the chamber, or on some firearms, it might be chambers. There might be multiple chambers. A firearm contains a cartridge, and when it's ready for firing, it is loaded in the chamber. So when we're looking for the safety of the firearm, we're going to be checking the chamber or chambers of the firearm to make sure there's no ammunition. And the moving parts of the firearm are called the action. So when I open the action, open the moving parts, that is how I inspect the firearm. And I'm looking for ammunition that would be found in the chamber. A second place that we might find ammunition is something called a magazine. A magazine is the part of the firearm that contains the spare cartridges. So this would be a magazine. So some firearms only have a single chamber, and then the rest of the cartridges are contained in a magazine. Some magazines are detachable, like this one. Some magazines are built into the firearm. And there's a couple of different types of magazines. So the box magazine holds all the cartridges stacked one on top of the other. The second type of magazine is called a tubular magazine, and this holds the cartridges nose to tail in a tube directly below the barrel. Safety-wise, firearms with tubular magazines have always been problematic for the very simple reason that you can't take that tubular magazine out. You can't see inside it. And there's been situations in which grandfather's rifle has been hanging in the rec room for the last 30 years. They take it to a gunsmith, let's clean it up, let's do something with it. They take it apart and it's been loaded because there's a cartridge stuck inside that tubular magazine. Whether it's dirt, grease, a dent in it, there's always the possibility. Now, the way around that is very, very simple. At the end of that tube is just simply a long spring and just a little plug that holds the spring in place. And as the cartridges are loaded, it simply compresses the spring, and it's that little plastic or metal plug that's pushing on each of the cartridges. To check it is very, very simple. That plug is called the follower. If it's all the way at the back of the tube where you can see it, there's nothing in there. And that's all people had to do is move the action, the moving parts, expose the chamber, and then look down for that little plastic or metal plug called the follower. And that's all there was to it. That way you can test a tubular magazine for safety just as effectively as a box magazine. And the chamber of the firearm, that's the part where the ammunition is contained. So the ammunition is called a cartridge. The ammunition is not found in the barrel. It's found in that enlarged part of the barrel at the back of the firearm called the chamber. The part that makes it go, the trigger. Trigger is protected by something called a trigger guard. One of our basic firearm safety rules will always be that you never have your finger inside the trigger guard unless you're actually firing the firearm. And when I say firing the firearm, I don't mean getting ready to fire the firearm. I mean actually pulling the trigger. So as soon as somebody has finished firing the firearm, their finger should immediately come right outside that trigger guard. One of the biggest safety rule violations, of course, besides pointing that firearm in an unsafe direction, would be having their finger inside the trigger guard. And of course, you combine the two of those and there's an accident just simply waiting to happen. The ejection port is the part where the empty cartridge or the live cartridge, if you're unloading the live cartridge, comes out of the firearm. It ejects out the ejection port. The safety, some firearms have safeties. A safety is a mechanical device, button, lever, switch. Some of them are manual, some of them are built-in or automatic. Basically, it's designed to prevent the firearm from being fired if it gets dropped out of your hands. A safety does not make a firearm safe. It's a button, lever, switch, right? Safety with a firearm, and this is one of the things we emphasize so much when we're teaching firearm safety. Safety of a firearm is keep it pointed in a safe direction, keep your finger out of the trigger. If it has a safety, great, we have it on, we never trust it. And we don't ever rely on that safety to prevent that firearm from being fired. It's just a mechanical device. Cartridges are the ammunition. There's a wide range of cartridges out there. So when we talk about a cartridge, that's the ammunition. We could also use interchangeable terms like a round. This magazine holds 10 rounds of ammunition. That means 10 cartridges, 10 shells. All of those are interchangeable terms for cartridge. If we take a cartridge apart, you can see one of the terms that we don't use for a cartridge. And people make this mistake all the time. I hear this in court all the time. They call it a bullet. It's not a bullet for the very simple reason that the projectile is the bullet. The whole thing together is the cartridge. So inside the cartridge, we have a bullet, the projectile. We have the case that contains the bullet and the gunpowder. And then the last component necessary to fire that cartridge is a little tiny sparking cap called the primer. The way it works is the firing pin strikes the primer, creates a hot spark, and that ignites the gunpowder, which then burns, creating rapidly expanding gases, and that pushes the bullet out the end of the case, down the barrel, and emerging out the muzzle. So if you take a look at the cutaway, you can see our 4 components there: the bullet, case, gunpowder, primer. Many different types of cartridges. There's probably thousands of cartridges out there. They're designated by the name of the cartridge. Everybody who has created or designed a cartridge has added a name to it. The names don't necessarily mean anything. They could mean a lot of different things. People can name it after the city they lived in, like 30-06 Springfield, named after Springfield, Massachusetts. The country, 303 British, things like that. They name it because it sounded cool. 38 Special sounded far more cool than a 38 Ordinary. 357 Magnum, you attach the name Magnum, it's going to sound so powerful. It doesn't really mean anything. That's the name of the cartridge. So there's 2 different categories of cartridges. One is called a rimfire cartridge, and this is where the primer is embedded in the rim. Generally, a rimfire cartridge are very small, much less powerful, still potentially dangerous, still potentially deadly. And then the second category is center fire cartridges, where that primer is located in the center. Much greater variety of center fire cartridges versus rimfire cartridges. We also have shotgun shells. Shotgun shells are a little bit unique. We have a case, which is called the hull. We have the gunpowder, we have the primer, but inside the shotgun shell, we have pellets called shot. And you can see in this little animation, you can see the pellets actually traveling down the barrel of a shotgun. As the pellets emerge out the barrel, they begin to spread out into what's called a pattern. There's a plastic wad inside the shell that travels down the barrel with the pellets, and that prevents the pellets from actually touching the barrel of the shotgun, and also prevents the pellets from being smashed into each other and flattening out and not flying straight. It also absorbs the energy of the shot. So the wad will simply fall away and it'll land somewhere out in the ground, probably a few meters out in front of that shotgun, and the pellets will continue. The purpose of the shotgun was originally for bird hunting. And you couldn't hunt a bird with a single bullet. That would be almost an impossible shot. Firing a pattern or a cloud of pellets into the sky at the bird, but not directly at the bird, actually in the air in front of the bird, is how bird hunters actually hunt. And that's the original purpose of the shotgun. So interesting here, inside the barrel of a rifle, and also inside the barrel of a handgun, we would find rifling. Inside the barrel of a shotgun, the barrel is nice and smooth. Now, if you've ever dealt with a case where there's a forensics issue, identifying which firearm was used in a particular crime, one of the things you cannot trace to a particular crime based on recovering the projectile is out of a shotgun. Because there's nothing that leaves a characteristic mark on the projectile or projectiles. A rifle, on the other hand, so the shotgun's fired birdshot. It could also fire what's called buckshot. It could also fire a slug. But again, there's no characteristic marks left behind from a shotgun. A rifle, on the other hand, has rifling in the barrel, hence the name rifle. Rifling is a pattern of grooves that are cut into a spiral pattern, and that grabs the bullet. And the bullet is actually microscopically larger than the actual barrel. And it leaves characteristic grooves on the outside of that projectile. So for example, in a murder case, if they could recover a suspect firearm, they could then, on a very, very powerful microscope, they could compare the tooling marks left behind on the bullet with a test sample fired from a suspect firearm, and they could tell that this particular bullet has been fired in this particular firearm. And if you're a big fan of James Bond, I just want to show you this. A lot of people don't realize the opening scene of James Bond with that very characteristic, that's the rifling of a barrel. That's exactly what that rifling looks like. Of course, I'm a big James Bond fan. You know, I've been reading Ian Fleming since I was a little kid. Now, that being said, one of the things I should point out is, again, real life was not a Hollywood movie, and the chances of actually recovering enough bullet to determine whether it was fired in that suspect firearm are very, very slim. The chances of actually having a case where they could say with absolute certainty that this bullet was fired in this firearm would be rare. Very simply because when those bullets strike, they deform. They may not even be able to find the bullet either. It may shatter. There's a lot of issues involved. So unlike what you see in CSI, it's not quite as easy as what they depict on television. If they could find the bullet, however, and they get enough bullet intact that they can actually determine, for example, the rifling, how many grooves there were in the rifling. It doesn't matter what direction the rifling is built into the firearm. It could twist the bullet. It gets the bullet moving, it twists it, and that rotates the bullet, and that adds the stability. It's like a football. It adds the stability. It doesn't matter whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise. Every manufacturer has their own idea on how many grooves, how tight the rifling is, whether it's clockwise or counterclockwise. There's a database available to forensics experts, and they could, if they recovered a bullet, they could actually determine with a fair amount of certainty the make and model of the firearm. Maybe not the exact, but they could narrow it down to probably 2 or 3 different makes and models of firearm that have the same characteristics of number of grooves, clockwise or counterclockwise, how tight that is, things like that. They could narrow it down. So they could say, even without the firearm, they could say, okay, the murder has been committed by a Remington Model 700 in this particular cartridge, 308 Winchester.
I'm just sorry, I apologize for interrupting, but I'm just wondering, with the advent of 3D printing.
Yeah.
Could I, well, first off, can I 3D print a rifled barrel? If I could, does that not now create, I mean, obviously I can make entirely unique rifling.
Yep.
which would match it exactly, but at the same point, make it impossible to ever, or theoretically, I could model an existing firearm that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah. Theoretically possible. On the other hand, why would you bother putting in rifling? Because a 3D printed gun is used exclusively for crime. There's no target shooting purpose whatsoever,
Right.
obviously. A 3D gun is an invention of the media. There's no such thing as a 3D gun. You cannot make a gun, a firearm on a 3D printer. You can make the frame. You can make many of the parts. You can't make a firearm. You still need steel for the barrel. You still need steel for the slide. You still need steel for the internal parts. This is how people get arrested for 3D printed firearms because they need to buy those steel parts. So for example, on this particular one, and again, just doing my quick safety check, this is modeled after the Glock semi-automatic pistol. The slide is steel, the barrel is steel. The frame is made out of plastic. So you could 3D print the frame. You could 3D print the trigger. You could 3D print all of these parts. And one of the things you'll notice is the serial number. The
Right.
serial number plate is embedded into the plastic on the real life Glock semi-automatic. With a 3D printed frame, of course, there is no serial number. I'm completely untraceable. So the answer is you could build the barrel out of a 3D printer, but you're probably not going to survive.
And that was the next question is single use shot, I recognize,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it won't survive the actual
No, it
expanding
will not
gas.
survive. You'll never get off a second shot, and the chances of you being severely injured in that first shot are probably pretty good.
Thank you.
So there's the answer on 3D printers. So how do we classify firearms in Canada? A couple of different ways we classify the type of firearm. So for example, we've talked about rifles having a rifling in the barrel that fires a single projectile called a bullet. We talked about shotguns firing shot pellets. And then we are also discussing handguns. Handgun is the same as rifle. Just consider that it's a more compact rifle that's designed to be fired in one hand. So that's one way, is the type of firearm. Second way we classify firearms is by the type of action. The action is the moving parts of the firearm. So there's, for example, 6 different types of actions. The third way we classify firearms is by the legal distinction, by the class of the firearm. This is where in court cases, they hear people referring to a firearm as being a non-restricted or a restricted or a prohibited firearm. There's 3 different classes. So if we look at the types of actions, and again, this is interesting terminology. A break action firearm, the simplest, you unload it by simply pushing an action release and it splits open and breaks open right at the chamber area. Single shot firearm, although sometimes it may have multiple barrels, multiple chambers, but it's a very simple basic. It's called a break action firearm. The next one is called the bolt action. A bolt action has a bolt handle that the operator, the shooter, manipulates. They open the bolt handle, pull it back to eject the empty. They push the bolt handle forward and then lock it down to load the next cartridge into the chamber. So this is a manually operated. They have to do that for every single shot. Third one is called a lever action, very similar to the bolt action, except that it's a lever at the bottom that you pull down. Instead of a bolt handle, you pull down on the lever, you pull up on the lever. Pulling down ejects the empty, pulling up loads the cartridge back into the chamber. Fourth one is called a pump action. And again, very similar, manually operated, but in this case, you pull the pump backwards. The pump is the front part of the stock. So it moves backwards, and that is what opens the bolt, which ejects the shell, and then pushing forward loads the next cartridge or shell into the chamber. The semi-automatic action. Semi-automatic action simply means that you pull the trigger and then the firearm does the rest of the work. The action works off the recoil of the firearm, so it will automatically open, ejecting the empty, and then automatically close, and that will chamber the next cartridge. Now, a semi-automatic sounds like evil and dangerous. It's no different than any of the other ones. It loads and fires for one pull of the trigger. It only loads and fires one cartridge at a time. If it was what we call an automatic firearm, that is the one that you hold the trigger and it just fires as rapidly as the action opens and closes. That's a machine gun, obviously prohibited weapon again. A semi-automatic action, on the other hand, you get one shot for every pull of the trigger. And our sixth action is probably unique mostly to handguns, and that is called a revolver. So, and I'll show everybody on Zoom once we come out of the presentation what a revolver actually looks like, but it has multiple chambers. And they call it a revolver because as I pull the trigger, it actually revolves. Each one of the chambers will revolve around the axis of the firearm. So those are our 6 different types of actions. So a firearm could be a rifle in any one of the 6 actions, could be a shotgun, any one of the 6 actions, could be a handgun, any one of the 6 actions. The next way we classify firearms is by the legal distinction. So the government of Canada has decided a non-restricted firearm will be the firearms that are commonly used for sporting purposes, target shooting, hunting. In fact, that's the only class you could actually use hunting. It has to be a non-restricted firearm. A non-restricted firearm is classified by exception. In other words, if you look in the law, there's nothing that says the definition non-restricted firearm. It simply says a non-restricted firearm is a firearm that is neither restricted nor prohibited. In other words, if they haven't classified into the other two, then it's non-restricted firearm. Very commonly, it would be rifles and shotguns. You can load and fire any place not otherwise prohibited. That's why they call it non-restricted. So if I lived out in the country, if I lived in a municipality that did not have any shooting and regulations against using firearms, as long as it was in a place that I could legally bring it to, if I'm on someone else's property and I have permission to be there, and as long as it's safe, I can shoot it anywhere. Anyone can own a non-restricted firearm. They don't have to be a particular occupation. You go to the gun store, you simply buy it. They look at your license, as long as, of course, you have a firearms license. You don't need a reason for owning. A restricted firearm, on the other hand, is called restricted because it is restricted to certain people. Even if I have a license, I can't go to a gun store and buy a restricted firearm. Now, most common example of restricted firearm is a handgun. They also call it restricted because I can't shoot it anywhere. I can only shoot it at an approved shooting range. I cannot shoot it out my back porch, even if I live out in the country. It has to be fired at an approved shooting range. And our third class of firearm is called a prohibited. And of course, this is probably the most common ones that many of your clients will be dealing with, the prohibited weapons, prohibited firearms. The one caution I always say is when you're getting into any kind of prohibited weapon, including prohibited firearms, prohibited ammunition, prohibited devices, everything has to be looked on a case-by-case basis. Simply because some firearms are non-restricted, some are restricted, some are prohibited. Some prohibited firearms, there's no legal ownership whatsoever. Other prohibited firearms, people could keep them as grandfathered collectors. Best example of that is full automatic firearms. Full automatic firearms became prohibited in 1978. If somebody was a collector of automatic weapons, they could keep them as grandfathered collectors. Now, the issue, of course, is that was back in 1978. What happens when all the people pass away? They can't pass them down to anyone else except other grandfathered collectors. Or they could sell it or give it away to a business, sell it or give it away to a museum, or have it destroyed or have it deactivated. So those would be the choices. So that would be one example. And that's why I say everything should really be looked at on a case-by-case basis. When we get into prohibited firearms and prohibited weapons, it can be very complex. Some prohibited firearms, such as handguns, the government decided back in 1995, when they first announced the law that was going to come into effect, called the Firearms Act in 1998, They were very concerned about these cheap handguns being made in factories in Florida and California, designed to sell to drug dealers. They cost $20 brand new, very, very low quality. So they thought, okay, let's ban anything with a short barrel or anything with a 25 caliber or 32 caliber cartridge. So they banned all of those firearms. Now, unfortunately, they also banned a lot of very high quality firearms, but the people who owned them could keep them as, again, grandfathered collectors. So these are referred to in the law as section 12.6 handguns. So for example, if I owned one of those 12.6 handguns on my license, it would say non-restricted, restricted, and prohibited section 12.6 handguns. I could still keep them. People that are participating in the Olympic Games could still keep them because they're widely used. 32 caliber cartridges are widely used in handgun target shooting in the Olympic Games. The interesting part of the law here is because this is one of the most recent parts of the law. This is about the only part of the law that's written in metric. Most other dimensions in firearms are written in imperial and then converted to metric. So this is one of the only parts of the law that is an inclusive dimension. In other words, if I had a handgun and it had exactly 105 millimeters in barrel length, it would be a prohibited handgun. If I sawed off a shotgun and cut the barrel down to exactly 18 inches, converted to 457 millimeters, it is not a prohibited because it is an exclusive dimension. This is the only dimension in the firearms law, to the best of my knowledge, that's an inclusive dimension. If it's exactly 105 millimeters, it falls into that prohibited category. Now, you're not going to have a client that has one of these simply because they're not cutting down anything or sawing off anything, and unless it's really, really short. It's never going to be right there on the edge. Also, the legal owners of section 12.6 handguns, I don't think any of them will be robbing 7-Eleven stores with any of these particular firearms. Here's what you'll find out on the street: sawed off, cut down, shortened firearms. Probably in the world of real firearms, and especially here in Manitoba, this is probably the most prevalent firearms used in crimes: cut down, sawed off rifles. Here's an example of a sawed off rifle. Any firearm that is cut down or sawed off to less than 18 inches in barrel length, and remember, it's an exclusive dimension. If it's exactly 18, it's not, but if it's less than 18, it is, and converted to 457 millimeters, is a prohibited firearm. So can somebody shorten the barrel of a shotgun? Grandfather passed away, they've got an old rifle, I want to keep it shorter, an old shotgun, I want to throw that in the back of my aircraft for survival when I'm flying up north in remote areas. Can I shorten the barrel? The answer is yes, as long as you don't shorten it to less than 457 millimeters. And the other dimension you have to be aware of is you can't shorten a firearm to less than 26 inches overall dimension. So 660 millimeters or 26 inches. So could I shorten a shotgun? Yes, as long as the barrel is 18 inches or more, and as long as the overall length is 26 inches or more. Now, the key here, the interesting quirk in this law, is it says sawed off. This means cut by someone after a firearm has been manufactured. Could I go to a gun store and buy a rifle or shotgun with a 14-inch barrel? The answer is absolutely. You can buy a shotgun with a 9-inch barrel. I wouldn't want to shoot it. The noise would be tremendous. It'd probably blind you from the muzzle flash, but it's still legal because it came out of the factory. And as long as the firearm is overall greater than 26 inches, if it comes out of the factory, nobody sawed it off or shortened, they can use it as a non-restricted firearm. Automatic firearms are another example of prohibited firearms. Automatic meaning hold of the trigger back, it fires rapidly. Any firearm prescribed by regulation. This is the biggest category. Prescribed by regulation, the firearms usually in an order in council are prohibited firearms by regulation. For example, the AK-47, which is the one on the top, the AR-15, which is the one on the right and on the bottom. All of those firearms are prohibited firearms by regulation. And again, the AK-47, no one could own. The AR style rifle, very popular target shooting rifle, extremely popular in the US, was also very popular in Canada. People that own them could keep them. They could still use them under certain conditions, but they can't sell them. They can't do anything. They can't take them to a gun range, all through order and council. The reason why that particular style of firearm, we call it sort of the AR pattern rifle. Why is it so popular? Well, somebody said it's like Lego for adults. You can buy accessories like crazy, and it's kind of like owning a boat. Being a fisherman, you don't own one fishing rod, you don't own one accessory for your boat, you own a million different things. And it became just sort of a hobby to accessorize these particular firearms. They're very modular construction. But now, of course, in Canada, they are prohibited by regulation. Prohibited devices, accessories prescribed by regulation. Certain stocks for firearms are prescribed by regulation. Silencers are a prohibited device in Canada. Ironically, there's other countries where silencers are required. In England, at shooting ranges, you have to have a silencer. Purpose of a silencer is it can't completely silence the sound of a shot, but it'll bring the decibel level down a little bit. So in England, they said, no, it's for the comfort of people nearby shooting ranges. In Canada, somebody decided a silencer's got to be illegal because it just looks dangerous. High capacity magazines, any magazine that exceeds the regulated capacity. So handguns have a maximum capacity of 10 rounds. Some rifles and some shotguns have a regulated capacity of 5 rounds. It has to be a semi-automatic center fire for it to be regulated. Bolt action rifles have no regulation. Pump action shotguns have no regulation. Semi-automatic center fire rifles and shotguns, 5-round capacity in the magazine. Handguns, 10-round capacity in the magazine. Pepper spray intended for or used against humans. Somebody uses bear spray against a human. It is now a prohibited device. Somebody brings in Bodyguard, exactly the same bear spray, but they just call it Bodyguard. They bring it from the US where it's legal. They bring it into Canada. It is now illegal. And the interesting part is that the bear spray or the dog spray that we can buy in Canada, perfectly legal, as long as we're not intending for or used against humans, perfectly legal. We can't bring that down to the US because they have restrictions on what they can sell to people for bear spray or pepper spray for used against animals. You have to be a certain occupation, a postal worker or in a remote hiker or something like that in a remote area. Bear spray or pepper spray intended for use against humans, perfectly legal in the US, not legal in Canada. So they actually can't cross the border going any direction whatsoever. Replica firearms. A replica firearm has to meet some very strict legal requirements. There's a lot of replica firearms used in crimes. What is the actual legal definition of a replica firearm? Well, first of all, it's not a pellet gun or a BB gun. Secondly, it has to be made out of wood, rubber, metal, or plastic, and it's got to be an exact copy of a real firearm. It can't be a generic looking, it's got to be a copy of the real one. And I asked for a court interpretation. There's been no case law on this yet, but basically they said that you would have to put the replica down on the table in front of a judge or jury and the real firearm and side by side not be able to tell the difference. And that would be the definition. It's got to resemble that real firearm, size, shape, color. What about airsoft guns? Airsoft guns are one of those little interesting quirks of the law. Low velocity airsoft guns were not BB guns or pellet guns, therefore not used for target shooting. So they would be considered a replica firearm. When they were first imported into Canada 30, 40 years ago, the manufacturers then started exporting into Canada using clear plastic parts. And they said that it does no longer resemble a real firearm by the color. Therefore, they were perfectly legal. You can go to Canadian Tire, you can buy an airsoft gun because part of it is made out of clear plastic. About 10 years ago, the airsoft manufacturers started to look at the the actual writing of the law. And they said, well, what if we built an exact copy of a real firearm with a much higher velocity? Then you could use it for target shooting. As long as you didn't go over 500 feet per second, because that would be the definition of a firearm. As long as you kept it under 500 feet per second, but much higher velocity than the typical airsoft guns, we could make exact copies. We wouldn't need clear plastic. It could look exactly the same as a real firearm. And because that's not regulated, the interesting quirk of the law is the airsoft guns that could hurt people are toys. Airsoft guns that can't hurt anybody are illegal. Now, the one thing to remember, however, though, is this is nothing to do with an imitation firearm. A replica firearm is just something incidental. An officer is investigating a break-in a house and sees a replica firearm sitting on the table. You know, it may be illegal just for the possession of it. It's incidental. An imitation firearm, on the other hand, is something that is used in a crime. And the standard for an imitation firearm is far less than the standard for a replica firearm. If somebody believes that it's a firearm or is led to believe it's a firearm, it could be considered an imitation firearm. Now, it doesn't even have to look anything like a firearm. In fact, and I actually talked to Michael Walker about this. There is case law that says, stick a finger in your pocket and say to a bank teller, this is a gun, give me the money, is not considered an imitation firearm. It would have to be something just a little bit higher than that. But like I said, an imitation firearm, it's used in a crime and it does not need to meet the legal definition of a replica firearm. It doesn't even have to look close. As long as somebody believes it was a firearm or is led to believe it was a firearm, that would be considered an imitation firearm. So how do people acquire firearms in Canada? Legally, you need a possession and acquisition license, sometimes referred to as a PAL. And in order to get your possession acquisition license, you have to apply. It's good for 5 years, very similar to a passport. You need proof of safety training, spousal notification. In other words, you have to report your spouse or ex-spouse if it's anywhere in the past 2 years. If there's a relationship breakdown, you report that. They will very often, especially on your first one, they will check with that spouse or ex-spouse to see if they have any concerns. The spouse or ex-spouse can't necessarily have your firearms license rejected, but they could certainly initiate an investigation. You would need references, people that have known you for 3 years or more and could potentially attest to your stability as a firearms owner. There's questions on your personal history as well. So all of these things are on the application form for the possession acquisition license. Every 5 years, they have to reapply. The one thing they don't have to do every 5 years is the safety training aspect. They just have to do that once in their lifetime. And the other part of that possession acquisition license is it's required to purchase ammunition. So somebody goes to a gun store, they want to buy some cartridges, they'd have to have a possession acquisition license. The safety training, there's 2 safety training courses in Canada. There's the Canadian Firearm Safety Course for non-restricted firearms, rifles and shotguns. And there's the Canadian Restricted Firearm Safety Course. This deals primarily with handguns for handgun target shooters. So if someone was a handgun target shooter, at some point they would have taken 2 separate courses. They have to take the Canadian Firearm Safety Course first and then the Restricted Course second. Both courses are about 8 to 12 hours long. There's tests at the end of the course. And one of the tests will be on our basic firearm safety rules. So I was subject matter expert in the design of the Canadian Firearm Safety Course. And one of the things we did when we were looking at designing the course was coming up with acronyms to help people remember. So our basic firearm safety rules are defined by the acronym, the Vital 4 ACTS, ACTS. And one of the things we looked at is we didn't want to go to the American standard for the #1 rule. And they say something like in the US, they say, don't point a firearm at anything you don't want destroyed. We looked at that and we said, this is kind of silly because I pick up a firearm in a safety course and I safety check it. But I don't want to destroy the wall. I don't want to destroy the television set. I don't want to destroy it. It didn't make any sense. So we said, okay, let's change that. And let's just say, assume every firearm is loaded. And then the second part is, how do you actually treat a firearm like it's loaded? You control the muzzle direction at all times. The third one we mentioned already, and that is trigger finger must be kept off the trigger and out of the trigger guard. And the fourth one is very simple. You pick up a firearm, first thing you do is see that it's unloaded. Prove it safe. So those are our 4 basic firearm safety rules. The prove it safe part is another acronym, and this is the actual steps that people follow in the hands-on handling of the firearm. P stands for point the firearm in safest available direction. R stands for remove all ammunition. O stands for observe the chamber or chambers. V stands for verify the feeding path. And finally, E, examine the bore for obstructions. If there was something stuck in the barrel of the firearm, and somebody were to fire a cartridge, the barrel would explode. It cannot push an obstruction out. It could potentially cause very serious injury or death. So I think now would probably be a really good time. Let's come out of the presentation for a little bit. And I'm just going to give everybody a little demonstration here. So the first one I'm going to have a look at is the revolver. The revolver means multiple chambers. And as I pull the trigger, the entire cylinder rotates. So our proof safety check-in procedure, point the firearm in the safest available direction. And I'm pointing this well away from everybody. Remove all ammunition. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing a cylinder release and the entire cylinder has now swung out like that. So that is manipulating the action to remove all ammunition. Now, I don't assume that it's all out. I have to actually look inside the chamber or in a revolver, multiple chambers. So, and I'll just turn this a little bit more so you can see inside each one of these holes is where the ammunition is normally contained. So I'm noticing that every single one of those holes is completely empty. So that's the observe part. Verify the feeding path. Well, it doesn't feed. So I just skip to the last part, which is examine the bore for obstruction, examine the inside of the bore. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking a little rod that fits down the barrel and I'm just pushing that all the way down the barrel until it emerges all the way out the end. And I can tell that there's no obstructions in that firearm. So every time a firearm is handled, they should be following the prove safety check-in procedure. The second one that I'm going to demonstrate is the semi-automatic firearm. So again, this is not the real one. This is a BB gun version. This is a copy of the Glock semi-automatic pistol. Probably 75% of police agencies in North America issue the Glock semi-automatic pistol to their officers. By far the most common police issue firearm. Because it's a semi-automatic, it has a detachable magazine. So point the firearm in safest available direction, remove the ammunition, and the firearm magazine has to always come out first. Once I've removed the magazine, then I'm going to open the action, the moving parts of the firearm. So in this case, it's the slide. The slide is what gets it to function. It's going to be going back and forth for every shot. So I manipulate the slide and I actually lock it open like that. And then I always observe the chamber, which is a hole at the back of the barrel. There's nothing there. Verify the feeding path. So this one does feed. So I'm going to look down where the magazine used to be. And the E is, of course, examine the bore for obstructions. Now, there's been actually a couple of court cases. I was involved in one particular court case where this particular situation happened. Somebody was checking the firearm before they handed it to their friend. And they checked the firearm by simply pulling back on the slide. It ejected the chambered cartridge, closed the action, and then they took the magazine out. So if you paid very close attention, you notice that I actually did that in the wrong order. And yet it was such a simple little mistake because now all I did was one came out, but the next one came right back in again. And in fact, there was a very serious tragedy that happened for police officers. A SWAT team was practicing in a high school and they were practicing what they were calling active shooter drills. And one of the things they did was they were practicing with just the empty gun. So they made sure that they were always empty. They checked them very carefully. And then they were just simply using their empty gun to point at each other. And then what happened in this particular case was one of the officers had to go outside to retrieve something out of his car. So he loaded his firearm, put the magazine in, came to the cartridge, stuck that in his holster. And then he came back inside and he was going to start the scenario. And they said, okay, hurry up. We started the scenario. Your partner is the bad guy. You're the good guy, and go. So he unloaded very quickly, took out the chambered cartridge, dropped the magazine out, pointed at his partner, pulled the trigger. Very serious, very, very tragic event. And lest you think that this is some small town in Texas, by the way, this is Calgary. Calgary SWAT officer shot and killed by his partner in a training scenario that should never have. It could have been prevented by the simple use of that proof safety checking procedure. So if we go back to our PowerPoint, you can see we're going to illustrate the actual procedure. And, you know, of course, sorry. Yep, no problem. Being involved in the film industry, I could also trace this back to John Eric Hexum, who put a gun loaded with a blank against his head. Brandon Lee, where there was a dummy bullet that was stuck in a barrel and nobody checked the barrel for obstructions. Very recently, Helena Hutchins, the director of photography on a movie called Rust that happened in New Mexico. All three of those deaths would have been prevented by the simple application of the proof procedure. Yeah, so it's just the one with the multiple photos.
Is that one?
Just right above that.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's the one. There we go.
Good grief. Sorry, new user on PowerPoint.
Down bottom right-hand corner, there's a tiny little, looks like a projector screen.
Thank
Right
you.
beside the smooth slider.
Right there. Hopefully.
Okay. So our proof safety checking procedure. So this is showing you the semi-automatic, the one that I just showed you. Point the firearm in the safest available direction. Remove all ammunition. Magazine has to come out first. Open the action. Once the action is open, then you go to the O, which is observe the chamber, the hole at the back of the barrel. Verify the feeding path, make sure nothing got stuck or left behind, and finally examine the bore for obstructions. So, and again, I can trace this back to tragedies that happen in real life, tragedies that happen in film sets. People would still be alive today. That's why I say the proof safety checking procedure saves lives. So this is what we really emphasize in our firearms safety training course. Now, I mentioned not everybody could own a restricted firearm. Who could legally own a restricted firearm? Well, they would have to have been involved in a business or an occupation, such as, for example, providing firearms to the film industry or working in an occupation such as an armored car guard. Second reason would be collecting. They'd have to be a legal collector of firearms. The third and probably the most common reason of all would be for target shooting purposes. They'd have to be a member of a gun club. And then the fourth one, believe it or not, we do have a provision in Canadian law where people could carry a concealed handgun for self-defense. The chances of anyone being allowed to do this are virtually nil. And basically what I was told from the chief firearms officer is that if you actually want to do this, it's an automatic rejection. And then you would actually have to take it to court and you would have to have a judge convinced that you would have to get that firearm for self-protection, meaning that the number of people in Canada who've ever gotten a license for self-protection with a handgun, concealed handgun in Canada, could be counted on the fingers of one hand, literally. There are some people that do carry handguns in remote areas for wildlife defense. And again, extremely rare for somebody to have a license. Basically, a rule of thumb is if somebody's got a concealed handgun, they better be a law enforcement officer or they're illegal. There's really the chances of them having a legal license as a civilian slim to virtually none. Here's a legal definition of a loaded firearm, because again, this became a court case. This is a case that came up here in Manitoba. What is a loaded firearm? A loaded firearm is defined as a firearm with a cartridge in the chamber or in the magazine if the magazine is attached to the firearm itself. The second part of the law says you can only load a firearm at a place that you can discharge that firearm. So for example, I couldn't load a firearm if I live in the city of Winnipeg. I couldn't load it in my basement. That would be an illegal act because I can't discharge it in my basement. So could I have a loaded magazine beside the firearm? That is not considered a loaded firearm. Now, that would of course be considered unsafe storage, but it's not a loaded firearm. It would have to be in the attached magazine. That is considered a loaded firearm. Storage and transportation regulations. Firearms have to be stored unloaded, and an additional step to prevent that firearm from being fired, meaning a trigger lock or cable lock. Or it could be removing the bolt, or it could be a container such as a gun case, a cabinet, a vault, not easily broken open or into. Now, here's another interesting part, and this was the part that I was actually brought in as an expert witness, that definition, not easily broken open or into. There's nothing specific that says what that really means. So the interpretation was that it would have to be difficult for the average person, like a child in your home, to break into the case. You would need tools, you'd need to do damage, you'd need to make noise, something like that. You couldn't just simply open it with your hand. And so anything that's got a lock on it or anything that makes it very difficult to get into, that could legally be considered broken open or into. And again, there's the case law, but there's no actual specific definition of what that means. And the one thing that, one of the things that I brought out in court was the fact that the intent of the law is not to prevent the theft. Because if you think about it, I've got an unloaded firearm in a case that's meeting my storage regulations. Well, someone could just steal the whole case. I haven't done anything wrong. So it's not the prevention of the theft, it's the prevention of an accident happening in your home. That's the intent of the law. Not within easy access to ammunition. That means ammunition should be in a different room, should be in its own lock case. Ammunition can be in the case with the firearm if the case is locked, can't be in the firearm itself. But it could be in the case or in the cabinet, in the vault with firearms, as long as it's not in the firearm. When it comes to restricted firearms, much higher standard. They need that secure locking device and an additional step. So there's got to be trigger lock or cable lock plus a locked container, trigger lock, cable lock, or a locked room, locked vault, locked case, something like that. Or the one interesting thing about restricted firearm is if you actually own a vault, that would be sufficient in and of itself. And when we're talking about a vault, we're talking about something very, very strong, usually expensive, very heavy, not a Canadian Tire gun vault for $189. They're talking about something much stronger than that. So there's our storage regulations. And again, not within easy access to firearms. And let's just check the time here.
13.
Okay. I'm gonna see. Okay. So I just want to go through transportation, because again, a court case could come up. Firearms that are non-restricted can be transported unloaded, and that's it. That's the only requirement. Could somebody drive down the highway with an unloaded rifle beside them? Yes. Would that be a smart thing to do? No. But you could do that. If the vehicle is unattended, the firearm then must be out of sight. The vehicle's locked with the firearm out of sight, or it's locked in the trunk. So a hunter going out hunting, they have the rifle in the rifle rack in the back window. You don't see too many of those, but in some cases it might be pretty popular. But if they're stopping for lunch somewhere, they've got to hide it and they've got to lock that vehicle. The only exception is muzzle loading firearms. Muzzle loading firearms can be temporarily transported from one hunting site to another. Still loaded with a charge in the barrel. You've got to take off the percussion cap or take off the flint. And I'm not going to get into too many details on muzzle loading firearms because that becomes a very, very complex type subject. And the other exception is firearms needed for predator defense in remote. We're not talking rural areas, we're talking remote areas. For example, I do a lot of training with government agencies that are going up to polar bear country in the high Arctic. They carry shotguns fully loaded 24 hours a day because of the threat of things like large bears. The only exception there is that if it's transported in a vehicle, it has to be unloaded. The rest of the time can be fully loaded. Now, their standard practice is not to carry around in the chamber, to carry all the ammunition just in the magazine. But at the same time, as soon as they get into a vehicle, and that makes sense. The polar bear is probably not going to eat the entire vehicle. Although I've seen some of those polar bears and you get the tundra buggies, and I've seen polar bears climb up on the side of a tundra buggy and just shake it like it was like a box of Cracker Jacks, with a little prize inside. Restricted firearms, again, higher standard. Prevented from firing a secure locking device, and it must be transported in a locked container. And it says opaque, meaning you can't see into it. And it has to be accompanied by an appropriate authorization of transport, which is the permit to go from a specific place. So for example, if I'm going from my home to a shooting range, I would need a permit to go from my home to the shooting range and back again.
Do you have to get that permit every time you move it, or is there like?
It depends on the circumstance. If I'm taking it to a gunsmith and it's a one-time use, I would get that permit every time. If I was teaching a Canadian firearm safety course in one specific fixed location all the time, I could get a permit for 5 years. If I'm going to a gun range and I'm a member of a gun club, I could get that permit for 5 years. Now, a couple of years ago, the government said, okay, if you're going to and from a gun range, because you're a target shooter, there's no sense actually getting that permit, a separate permit. So they made it inherent in the license itself. So going to and from a gun range, I actually don't need a separate permit. It's in my license itself. But any other activity, going to a gunsmith, safety course, things like that, then I would need the permit as one-time use. Yeah. Or moving, if I'm moving, changing addresses, I have to get a permit to go from the old address to the new address. And again, that would be a one-time use permit. And that's all done online or over the telephone now. It's something can be done very, very quickly. So firearms offenses. So these are some of the typical offenses. And again, I'm not going to go into any detail on all those, but these are some of the charges that potentially would come up with some of your clients. Unauthorized possession of firearms, unauthorized possession of a prohibited weapon, unauthorized possession of a restricted weapon, unauthorized possession of prohibited device. Now, another interesting quirk in the law, there is no charge for the possession of a replica firearm. You cannot import it, you cannot manufacture it, and you cannot sell it. But there's no charge on the possession of it. Now, again, we're not talking imitation firearm, we're talking about an incidental, it's not used in a crime, not used to threaten anybody, it's just sitting there on the table. Is it illegal? It's not illegal to possess. Prohibited ammunition. There's certain types of ammunition that are prohibited by law. Possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with the ammunition for that firearm is also a charge. Weapons trafficking is a charge. Transfer without authority is a charge. If I'm selling my rifle or shotgun to someone else, I would have to make sure that that person actually has a valid possession and acquisition license. Otherwise, that would be a charge of transfer without authority. And then finally, that one that I said, the imitation weapon used in crime. And again, does not have to meet the definition of a replica. It's far less. As long as someone is led to believe that it's a firearm, then that imitation weapon charge could happen. Some of the myths that people deal with all the time. I love this particular line. This is from Die Hard 2, where John McClane says to the airport officer that got to be a terrorist. How do you know he's a terrorist? Well, he pulled a Glock 7. It's a porcelain gun made in Germany and doesn't show up on airport x-rays, costs more than you're making them up. That's like 5 lies all in one. I mean, you know, there's no such thing as a Glock 7. It's actually Glock 17. It's not made out of porcelain. It's made out of steel and high impact polymer. It does show up on airport x-rays quite nicely. You can still see the plastic in there. And it does not cost more than that person makes in a month, unless they don't really make a whole heck of a lot of money. It's actually one of the less expensive handguns available in the market. So this is a quote from 1855, and I love this. A lie goes around the world while truth is pulling its boots on. 1855, and they were already foreseeing the internet. The myth of the medical miracle. Good guy gets shot in the shoulder, you're gonna be fine an hour later. Bad guy, no. I had a doctor who looked at that and said to me, if you're shot in the shoulder, you could be on the steps of a trauma hospital. You could be shot in the shoulder of the operating room in the trauma hospital, and you're probably still not gonna survive. That is something that is extremely life-threatening. This is not anything like real life. This is my CSI effect. You got to solve every crime in 42 minutes. DNA results, they come right out of the computer. And as soon as they come out of the computer, they're going to tell you the name and address of every single potential assailant and all of their accomplices and everything they had for breakfast that morning and you name it. Come on. We know DNA results come out in months.
If you're lucky.
If you're lucky, sometimes years. All firearms leave rifling marks on the barrel. No, they don't. You're lucky if you recover a bullet, you might get maybe 20% of them. You might get enough that you could actually determine the rifling marks. Any type of metal to metal contact will leave characteristic marks. And they're very, very exclusive. They're as exclusive as fingerprints. So for example, if I wanted to commit a murder and get away with it, I'd use a shotgun because it doesn't leave any marks behind. I'm not saying I will, but however, there's marks from the firing pin striking the primer. So if I leave the empty shell casings behind, they could potentially trace that back to the firearm. The problem with that is that this is not an exact science. The world would lead us to believe this is an exact science. This is sometimes referred to as junk science. You know how like hair samples basically became labeled as junk science about 20 years ago. The firearms marks are really considered far less reliable. And just to illustrate, here's another quote, 1894. Common sense. Science is common sense. Yes, it absolutely is. In my line, you know, amateur practices until they get it right. Professional practices until they can't get it wrong. You know, somebody says, well, what does that mean? I say, okay, you're a skydiver. And do you want your parachute packed by the amateur who finally got it right after 10 tries, or the professional who's never gotten it wrong in 30 years? You know, you figure it out. So Scientific American did an article back in 2022, and they sent, they looked at samples of bullets, samples of tooling marks on firearms, and they sent it out to a bunch of examiners, and they found that 60% of the time, when they examined it a second time, they only came to the same conclusion 60% of the time. That's how inexact the science was. When examined by a different examiner, they only came to the same conclusion 30% of the time. So this is where I would be very, very careful on any kind of forensics. If somebody is stating this is an exact science, no, this is not an exact science. And I'm going to go into, keep talking. This last myth. Police officers are expert shots, they could have just shot him in the leg. No, they can't. This is called the fight or flight syndrome. This is what happens to the human body under stress. Life-threatening, your heart rate increases. Blood flow concentrates to the center mass of the body. Blood flow is lost to the extremities, arms, legs. One of the biggest losses is loss of fine motor skills. You lose blood flow to your fingers. You know, you're late for court and you can't find your car keys and you end up dropping them on the ground like 3 or 4 times because you're going like, why am I so fumbly? Well, because you're under stress. That's just a little example. Imagine in life-threatening situations. So if you look at this, you understand, why do police officers train to shoot for the center mass of the body? Why could they never shoot for the arm or the leg? Because it wouldn't have any effect whatsoever. The person wouldn't even feel it. And it certainly wouldn't stop the threat. Adrenaline is a painkiller. That adrenaline is introduced into the bloodstream very, very rapidly. That increases the pain threshold. Tunnel vision means that you've lost your peripheral vision. What you're looking at becomes very sharp because the body can reshape your eyeball, but you don't realize that what you're looking at is very sharp, but you've lost everything else. It's described as like looking through a cardboard mailing tube. Everything else is sort of gray cloud closing in around you. Auditory exclusion. People firing firearms in high stress situations don't hear the sound of their own gunshots. There's a very good reason, for example, if you have, say, a situation where there's 4 police officers taking a stand, one officer said, I fired 3 shots. The next officer said, I heard 2. Next officer said, I heard 5. There's a really good reason for that. It's called auditory exclusion. If every single officer is telling you exactly the same story, something's wrong. Tachypsychia effect, meaning time seems to slow down in high stress events. This is where witnesses will say something like, they called the ambulance took, a long time to get there. The fire, police took a long time to get there. They checked the records and they were there in like 8 minutes and the person perceives it as being like 45 minutes. It's that tachypsychia effect. Time seems to slow down a little bit. Transition to police to the semi-automatic. The answer is very simple. You already know the answer. You're shooting for center mass of the human body in a high stress situation. Loss of fine motor skills means that the revolver was almost impossible to reload. Once you fired your 6 shots, you were done in a real life encounter. Semi-automatic is a very simple device. The magazine goes in, no fine motor skills needed whatsoever. And that's the reason why police officers are trained to shoot center mass. And that's why they switched to the semi-automatic pistol. It wasn't anything to do with the power. It wasn't anything to do with it holds more cartridges, which it does. It's simply the fact that in real life encounter situations, almost impossible to reload that revolver. So in the revolver training, 1970s, the training was all fixed targets, fixed positions, very, very static. Training has now evolved into much more dynamic situations. So what happened in Newhall, California in 1970, California Highway Patrol ran up against 2 murderers that were highly trained. They could not reload the revolvers. And this is where they decided they need to improve their training. They created what are called speed loaders, which for people here, this is just a little device that holds all the cartridges that improved it a little bit, but they still couldn't reload in real life situations. FBI murders, Dade County, Florida, 1986, where 2 murderers went up against the FBI agents. They ended up killing 2 and wounding 5 others. The agents that were issued revolvers could not reload them. The agents with semi-automatics could. It happened here in Canada. Caledon, Ontario, there's a shootout with the Ontario Provincial Police against a bank robber. The Ontario Provincial Police officer dropped his speed loader on the ground because of loss of fine motor skills and ended up getting shot. Thankfully, he survived. He actually filed a workplace complaint with the Ontario Safety and Health, and they came back with a ruling that said revolvers are unsafe for police officers, and that's why in Ontario they had a year to change. In the rest of Canada, everybody changed to semi-automatic. It was actually a workplace safety ruling from Ontario that was the big event in Canada. And if you're a fan of Canadian reality TV shows, by the way, and if you ever watched Canada's Worst Driver, which I really like, the OPP officer, or now former OPP officer, that was the officer who was shot in that particular situation, was Sergeant or ex-Sergeant Gamboli. personal friend of mine. We've talked a lot about that situation. He's described that situation in great detail, but he was the instigator of semi-automatics in Canada. So the need for semi-automatic pistols became very clear in those two particular situations. In RCMP, the murders in Mayerthorpe, they began to realize that a handgun is useless in very long-range encounters. They also, exactly the same thing in Moncton, New Brunswick in 2014. They were up against someone with a hunting rifle that was shooting at 100 meters away, and all they had to respond with were handguns. So this is the introduction of the police, what they call the patrol carbine. So the patrol carbine is not used only by SWAT or emergency response officers. It's used by regular patrol officers. So in the average police car right now, there's generally a patrol carbine used by almost any police agency in Canada. Some of them have a shotgun and a carbine, other than others have just the carbine. Carbine is simply a word that means a short barreled rifle. So this is how things have changed a lot in Canada. So if I were to change that little saying from 1855, I would change it into this one. Today, a lie goes around the world 20 times before truth even gets out of bed in the morning. If somebody is shot in the arm or the leg by a police officer, it's because the officer missed. They didn't do it deliberately. If every eyewitness tells the same story, something's wrong. There's been some collusion. They should have different stories. And to conclude, best gunfight in the world is the one that never happens in the first place. The whole purpose of police officers carrying firearms is hoping that they never ever have to use them. And of course, that applies to anyone using a firearm. And I've talked long enough. So anyone that's still with us and hasn't had to run off, I would love to answer any questions that anybody might have. So first of all, here, anyone have any questions?
That was very comprehensive.
Awesome. I thought a question, you would answer it in the next slides.
Yeah. Kevin, I see you've unmuted. You have a question?
Always. So my question is this. We're seeing a lot of these contraptions, some which can fire a cartridge and some which can't, as far as guns. Here, I'll put you on the video. I'm working at home right now with my sweatshirt on. So long story short, a lot of these contraptions, or some of them are clearly guns. It's kind of scary, actually, because they're boring out pellet guns. But the thing is, some of them, it's like they bored out a pellet gun, so I can see that being a firearm. You could strike and you know, cause the explosion, boom, out goes the projectile. I can see that.
Yeah.
But then some of them are just they're calling them guns sometimes, or they're contraptions, but basically what it does is it has a striker again for the cartridge, and then the barrel and the rest of the gun or contraption is just, it's a disaster. Like the RCMP won't even test them because they're afraid they're going to blow up or go the wrong direction.
I don't blame them.
So, neither do I. But the problem I have with that, and maybe you can answer this, is how does that become a firearm? Just because you can strike a cartridge and cause an explosion and cause the projectile to fly, I could put a cartridge into a vise, take a hammer and a nail, and shouldn't be saying this, but I know people have done that, where they do that and boom, and out it goes. And it's, you know, the vise isn't a gun or a firearm. So I guess the thing I'm struggling with is we're seeing more and more of these. And I guess the thing is, you know, just from an expert point of view, or you know, your experiences, the dealings you've had with the law, what's your take on all that?
So you're talking about what are sometimes referred to as sort of a zip gun. Just
Correct.
Very simple. Yeah. Sometimes even a firing pin is just a nail with an elastic band. But the difference between that and clamping a cartridge in a vise is very simple. If you actually tried that, what would happen is the bullet doesn't go anywhere. The bullet is the fixed part. It's the heaviest part. If it explodes and it's not in a chamber, what happens is the case will shatter and blast sideways. So therefore, you couldn't really call that a firearm. But the difference between that and the zip gun is the barrel. So the definition of a firearm is a barreled weapon through which a projectile could be fired. And this is how they would determine, this is, in my opinion, this is how they would determine that, yes, this meets the legal definition of a firearm because it has a barrel, even if it's extremely short, it has a barrel and that projectile can be fired. Without the barrel, you cannot fire a projectile. It just will not go anywhere. The firearm will just explode. And you make a really good point. No one wants to test one of these things because the chances of it actually exploding in your face are very, very high.
Right. So I guess my issue is, like some of them, like I haven't fired a gun for about 20 years, but I fired guns lots of my life. The thing is that I guess the issue I have is it's, what's a gun and what's a coyote roadrunner trap that isn't a gun, and if you can't fire it, or if it's, toilet paper roll for a barrel or something, I'm exaggerating, of course. But if you have something like that, when is it no longer a firearm?
That's a question I can't answer. I can just simply offer you an opinion and just say, no one wants to test it for very good reasons. And if in my opinion, it could fire once, even if that person is probably going to be injured by it blowing up in their face, but if it can launch that bullet, that projectile in a forward direction, then in my opinion, I would say it's a firearm.
Okay, but it has to have some type of barrel, right?
There would have to be something that would contain the cartridge in order to get the pressure going out the front of it. Yes. So there would have to be a chamber and a portion of the barrel.
Right. And I think this is really an area of law where it's not really been clarified, right? There hasn't been any cases there. But with all these zip guns, we'll probably see you in court on our side or the other side or somewhere there because
yeah, I completely agree with you. And and again, that's my opinion. I'm not a forensics firearms expert. I'm not a gunsmith.
Right.
So I would be basically looking at the legal definition of the firearm: barrel weapon, projectile that could cause serious injury or death.
Can I ask you another question? Are you seeing, like, I don't know how much you work with the police, but are you seeing like Americans have certain guns that are made for drug trade or, a Tech-9 or something like that?
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of Eastern European firearms that are extremely cheap, like, a Makarov you can pick up for $20 in the States.
Yeah.
Are those coming into Canada? It seems to be in Winnipeg, at least, we're a little bit behind times, which is good. We have somebody who's broken into somebody's house and sawed off the stock in the barrel. It's now their weapon.
Yeah, the Canadian government, because they prohibited just about anything that's military or military looking, they've basically shut down that market in a lot of those firearms that you talked about. Others that might be, a reasonable quality for target shooting, a Makarov handgun, for example, is fairly well made. So there would be some in Canada owned by collectors and legally owned by target shooters. But for the military style or military looking firearms, most of them have been restricted or prohibited in Canada.
Okay. No, but I'm just saying, if you've seen them cross the border, it seems like luckily our criminals aren't that smart or aggressive yet. That they would go to the States and get one of those. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And obviously the vast majority of firearms used in crimes in Canada are smuggled across the border. The chances of a legal restricted firearms owner, a target shooter, actually committing a crime would be very, very small.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry to bother you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Serena, do you have a question?
I do. Given you just stated that most of the crimes are committed with firearms illegally smuggled in, would you happen to know, because my practice is basically all rural, and I'm not sure that most of the gun cases that I deal with are things that have been smuggled in, as opposed to almost always long guns, usually shotguns and rifles, that I'm much more suspecting have been simply stolen from others in the community. I mean, I rarely ever see handgun cases in a rural practice as opposed to saw them way more in a city-based practice. So if obviously cities have higher volume, therefore have higher gun crimes, fair to say that it's not generally imported / smuggled weapons that are the problem in rural areas?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
absolutely correct. So there is obviously a market for stolen firearms. In Canada, if my firearm is missing or stolen or destroyed, I'd have to report that to the police. I have that legal obligation. But once it's gone, it's gone. And I think one of the things that we're seeing a lot of here in Manitoba is the fact that once those firearms get stolen, they get cut down, they're sawed off. And that's what we see is one of the big hazard on the street. So yes, there's no question at the very sort of lower end of crime, it's stolen firearms. At the higher end of crime, it would probably be things like handgun smuggle across the border.
Well, especially since there's currently a ban on transferring handguns to anybody in any way, isn't there?
Yeah, handguns are highly desirable on the criminal market and also very, very expensive. If somebody was looking to illegally purchase a handgun, they would have to bring in a fair amount of money. So you're absolutely correct, especially in rural areas, the theft of firearms from legal owners is probably the source of a lot of firearms.
And having said that, in the area you're in, that is where a lot of the handguns are. I used to be in the same community. There's a number of collectors in the Dauphin area who have restricted or prohibited and theoretically are grandfathered. And yeah, there's a fairly high level of terror should their houses be broken into. Because there's no crime in Dauphin. It's not a big problem. They've always had that door just locked.
Anyone else?
Not seeing anyone unmuting.
Just if my memory is correct, the C9 carbines are semi-automatic. They're not fully automatic. It's only Canadian forces in Canada who have full auto, right?
Some police agencies, but that would be extremely rare. Yes. So full automatic would generally be military only.
So there are actual police departments in Canada that have full auto?
Very rare in Canada to have full automatic. Just simply because there's no need for it. Full automatic is more as used by the military for suppressive fire, keep the bad guy's head down kind of thing.
No, I did a brief stint in the military, so I agree completely. I'm kind of just actually speechless at the idea, especially given it's needed for certain circumstances, that there are police departments in Canada that have it.
Yeah, and then
I'm more scared now.
Yeah. One of the interesting points about the police patrol carbine was the sighting system. They have gone to a red dot sight, which is something that's ideal for short and intermediate ranges because it's very, very accurate and it's also very, very fast. And it increases the public safety. It's not like the scope where you've got to have your eyeball placed exactly the right spot. It's sort of both eyes open, wide open. You can watch the threat the whole time, and it superimposes an electronic dot right where the bullet is going to impact. So much, much safer to handle. Plus the cartridge that you're using in the rifle is very similar to if you were served in the military. It's the same thing, 5.56 millimeter. It's a very tiny and very fragile bullet. And which means that it's probably, if it hits the bad guy or the bad person, it's probably not going to over penetrate and hit an innocent person behind them. And if the officer misses, it's probably not going to go through 2 layers of drywall. It's a very fragile bullet itself. So it's ideal for police, much, much safer for the general public to have them carry those patrol carbines.
I just have one quick question. Sorry again. I'm just spitballing this time. This isn't a real life thing. This is more theoretical. Is there, I don't know, and it just occurred to me, is there restrictions on modifying ammunition? Of course there is on handguns or firearms, but is there any sort of, as you're aware, I'll have to look at that later, but is there anything? No?
As far as I know, as long as the ammunition is not prohibited ammunition, There's nothing that says against the modifying of the ammunition. You know, a typical example, I guess, would somebody taking a hacksaw and trying to turn a full metal jacket bullet into a hollow point or an expanding bullet. There's no law that says you can't do that. And not to mention it's useless anyway. It's one of those myths that, you know, somebody in Hollywood showed, you know, you just cut it and then it's going to expand. It's going to be more dangerous, which isn't true anyway. In Canada, they prohibit ammunition. They're talking specifically about handgun ammunition designed to penetrate soft body armor. So if they modify it into that would be prohibited ammunition. Other than that, I can't think of a single thing that would prevent anybody.
Right, so for example, they spray it with Teflon, especially a rifle bullet. Now they're getting into that sort of ammunition, and now it would be restricted, sort of thing.
Spraying it with Teflon would be useless.
Really?
It would have
Okay.
a slight bit of effect. No, in the US, they sell ammunition that penetrates soft body armor. It's a very hard metal and it's a very specific shape that goes through the soft body armor. It's kind of turns a bullet into more like an edge weapon that goes through police body armor fairly effectively. So
Wow.
just the whole Hollywood thing of just, you know, spraying it with Teflon or doing something like that, that does not make something go through soft body armor. If the court case came up and they did a forensic test, it wouldn't have any effect on it whatsoever.
All right, thank you very much. Now that I'm asking stupid questions, I'll be quiet.
No such thing as a stupid question, my friend.
Or Kevin being quiet. Excuse me. On given the time, if anyone has any more questions, we'll come back to it. But otherwise, before you go, I just want a small token, a travel mug and some other little odds and ends. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
A very helpful, informational, wonderful. Thank you very much.
And you're very welcome, and thank you. And I just love getting in front of groups, and I love questions, and I can't promise to ever answer every single question that's out there. And but I've been involved in the firearms field for many, many years. My training is not the hunter safety end of it. My training has been more the professionals end of it, and military, government agencies, things like that. So, and then of course, working in Hollywood movies has been an interesting career for me as well.
Okay. Absent any more questions, I am going to end the recording and bid everyone goodbye. But thank you very much. And I will try and get the recording and the slides made available shortly. They are, just so we're clear, the recording and the slides are not to be distributed beyond your offices. But have a good day all. Bye.